The 2019 Intermarium Summit is over and enough time has passed in order for us to do a cold-hearted analysis and, of course, to point out what the rest of the cathedral has forgotten to mention. So, let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alrighty, so as most of you know, myself and my colleague from the Romanian language channel were among the accredited journalists at the 4th summit of the Three Seas Initiative, or the Intermarium, held in Ljubljana earlier this month. Once again, many thanks to all of those who have donated for that effort. We could not have done it without you. So, as always, the purpose for which we do go to these events is not just to catch statements and arguments that other media outlets may be reluctant to broadcast, like it was the case this year with Miguel Berger's outlandish Duginist shilling, but we also go to these events to gather knowledge of aspects that may never be aired to the public, and for bloody good reason. After all, we wouldn't want the whole public, and thus including our enemies, to know everything about everything. With that said, there are several things that should be known, at least to those interested in geopolitics, that were not broadcasted at all by the other accredited journalists or was presented without proper context, or Reuters style, as I like to call it. So, for these reasons, this video exists as an epilogue to the reporting from this year's summit. So, first of all, it is important to mention that the overall media presence was a lot lower this year than it was last year. And this is despite the fact that the accreditation process started earlier. I have my own suspicions as to why that was the case, but suffice to say that the event got nowhere near the amount of coverage it deserved. And I refer here particularly to the Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian media, whose presence was, numerically speaking, way too low. And just like last year, most of the journalists were the typical cathedral NPCs or tabloid style of journalists looking for things that could be sensationalized into a breaking news type of story. Now, I don't blame them as people, but I do blame the editorial boards who send them there, because these types of events do require thoughtful approach, and the way the political platform is constructed is specifically made for that kind of approach rather than a sensationalist one. As a result, less instant coverage and more thought put into the analysis is preferable. But I guess that's why we go to the summit, in order to deliver for that niche. Alrighty, so enough with the media. Let's talk about the positive developments after this summit. I have identified four positive developments that are, at least in my opinion, of utmost importance. So, the first positive development is the Three Seas Initiative Investment Fund becoming fully operational. Now, this is in itself almost unbelievable news on several levels. First of all, because it is one of the rare instances when such a fund was started in less than 2 years. It usually does take at least 2 years of negotiations to start such a fund at this level. Yet the Intermarium Fund, started with a non-binding letter of intent last September in Bucharest, became fully operational this month with an initial capitalization of $565-ish million, mostly from Exim Bank Romania and Bank Gospodarstwa Krajowego from Poland, and a smaller participation from Exxon. Now, this in and of itself may not sound so spectacular, but then again, no investment fund started big, and no investment fund at this level in recent history was even able to reach this level to begin with in just 9 months that passed since the letter of intent was signed and until full operational status. Geopolitically, this investment fund is even more important than economically, precisely because it puts our money where our mouth is. And by our, I mean those of us who support the initiative. And from the off-the-record discussions I've had already with officials from the Business Forum, there will be investment opportunities for non-corporate private parties too. So even I personally will put my money where my mouth is when the opportunity shall become available. Now, this matters geopolitically because it strengthens the argument that the Intermarium region not only needs, but can take over its own destiny. On the short run, it also strengthens the argument with and against the Western bully, otherwise known as Germany, as well as with the extension of Germany by other means, colloquially known as the European Union. And yes, I know what some of you might be thinking, but more on that later in the video. Yes, I will address the EU issue as well. The second positive development is the progress on the Chambers of Commerce network. Now, to be perfectly honest, this was the only thing I did expect to happen, not only because of the informal conversations I've had last year with the Romanian Chamber of Commerce officials, but generally because I do expect, based on history and basic wisdom, that the business community will work faster and better than government. And they did. This is relevant for us in two major ways. One, because it will come with more investment opportunities and trade options that were simply not available 3 or 4 years ago, and it was terrible because these didn't exist. And two, because it will increase the flow of information between the business communities in the Intermarium region. This is particularly important in this day and age because lack of information tends to be thoroughly detrimental to our countries, even more so than lack of resources. Or, in simpler terms, being in the know oftentimes matters a lot more than how much money do you have available. Now, of course, this development is far from ideal, but as we've been saying on this channel since at the very least 2017, this is an initiative that should be judged in civilizational terms and not in terms of a 1 or 5 year plan. And strictly in the economic sense, we should be quite happy with the way things are going because they're going much better than even the most optimistic forecasters expected. Now, of course, that doesn't mean it will always be like that, and those of us in the Intermarium should know this better than anyone, as the lessons of history tend to be pretty harsh on us. But still, realistically speaking, things are progressing at a more than decent pace on the economic front. No time for a party, but surely a short toast is in order. Now, the third positive development that almost nobody in the cathedral media noticed is the emergence of the idea we suggested on this channel last year, namely to get diplomatically lower levels of government involved as well. The president of the Czech Republic floated this idea, but it was also on almost everyone's lips during the other less flashy panels where filming was restricted, but taking notes and attending was not. I mean, being an accredited journalist does come with perks. That's why I insist to go to these events, preferably each year, though next year might be a challenge. We'll see about that. Anyway, the main limitation of the platform right now is indeed the fact that it is primarily at a presidential level. Now, this makes sense since it was started by the presidents of Croatia and Poland, but this does not and should not mean it has to stay that way. One reason is because our countries are, with various degrees, parliamentary republics. Now, this means that the head of state has very limited powers. So expanding the platform to include lower levels of government from a diplomatic perspective, and here I refer specifically to the Ministry of National Defense, first and foremost, should also increase the level of cohesiveness a little bit. Now, I am not, how should I put this? I'm not holding my breath on this going smoothly, of course. After all, we're still talking about government bureaucrats here. But from an institutional perspective, it is desirable for our RB's chief of staff to speak to each other from time to time. And from a practical perspective, this makes sense as well. The de facto heads of the military tend to know better what the military needs than the politicians. So this is why I believe the expansion of the initiative to lower levels is a positive development. Of course, it remains to be seen whether it will work out. Nobody can know this beforehand because it has never been done in the past. The previous incarnation of the intermarium never got to this level. So, it's worth a shot, to be sure. And finally, the fourth positive development during this summit is the shelving of the idea of extending full membership to Germany. Now, it is not a secret that I would prefer Germany to never be invited to begin with, but one of the deeply worrying developments of last year's summit was the floating of the idea of extending full membership to Germany, an idea coming primarily from the Romanian president, or as we call him around here, our own German problem. So it is thus a positive development that that particularly terrible idea has been shelved, because it means there will still be room for correcting it in the future. The objection over Germany's permanent membership is not just a geopolitical and cultural one, but also one of practical politics. The current German state is deeply Duginist in nature, so having Germany at the table is just as bad as having Russia at the table. And given Germany's both historical and present-day tendency of cutting deals with Russia at the explicit expense of the intermarium, it is thus bad politics to grant full membership to Germany at this stage of the initiative. Again, the more optimistic analysts will tell you that these things can change and that they're not set in stone, which might be true in theory. The problem is that the record of history insists on disagreeing, and it is preferable to be mindful of the record of history, given that the very existence of this initiative is as a result of looking at the said record of history. So it may not be the best case scenario, but nonetheless it is a positive development to see that the full membership of Germany wasn't even a topic of conversation, and it is preferable that it stays that way for a while. Now, while we're on the topic of Germany, let's go to the negative developments. The first one being that Germany is still being invited. I mean, please allow me to remind you what was Germany's most significant contribution to this year's summit.
And we always say to our US colleagues, LNG is welcome in Europe, it is welcome in Germany. Mr. Naimski has mentioned the positive impact it has had in Poland. We have had the same in the Baltics, where it has helped to drive prices down, to reduce dependency. But we also say to the US, LNG has to be market-driven. What we don't want, and let me say that also very clearly, is that LNG is helped by US sanctions. We totally reject sanctions against the energy relationship with Russia. Nord Stream 2 was mentioned, again with false information that it is a single connection. It is not a single connection, it's an additional connection. There is a serious and real demand for additional gas. So I think we really have to stick here to the facts. But let me say, LNG is welcome. sanctions are rejected. We want to develop our energy relations with Russia the way we think it is necessary and it is good for Germany. And Russia is not the only source of supply. That is false. Russia is below 40% of Germany's gas supply. We have Norway, we have the Netherlands, but the Netherlands will reduce. Germany's own production will reduce. So there is a definite need for more diversification.
So yeah, Dugin is shilling. You can call me an extremist if you like, but it's not unreasonable to say that the whole thing could have gone just fine without having the Duginist perspective as well. It's not like we don't know it already, and so why waste the time? Or for the presidents of Slovenia and Estonia who are so much into the green nonsense, why waste energy and increase the carbon footprint by flying in the German official? Serious question. Now, speaking of the Slovenian president, the second negative development is the fact that the decision to invite Ukraine was deferred to the organizer, which was the Slovenian president, who decided, likely upon consulting his vast wisdom or something, not to invite Volodymyr Zelensky, the newly elected president of Ukraine. Let's listen to his explanation.
Good morning, Angelika Jarosławska-Sapiecha. I'm coming from Poland. I'm Poland 3.0 program coordinator. I have a question. Strong and stable Ukraine and strong intermarium means safety of this part of the world. Isn't it the highest time to invite Ukraine to those conversations, to invite Ukraine to the cooperation with the Free Seas Initiative?
As the host of this summit, I would be frank with you, saying that we did consider this option to invite the new Ukrainian president to come, but we then decided that maybe it's time to invite him next year.
Yeah, that's kind of terrible. But you know what's even more terrible? The response of the Estonian president, who basically said that she defers to the collective and to the European Union. That kind of diplomatic irresponsibility is, quite frankly, atrocious. Thankfully, it was somewhat corrected by Rick Perry, but the damage had already been done. Now let's watch the whole exchange.
So I don't know if Kersti will give us some explanation on that subject.
Actually, I think that, as already stressed here, we have an informal forum of Free Seas Initiative, and it's really something where Ukraine and Georgia and other Eastern partners are concerned, where I would stick to the formal framework of Eastern Partnership and really look how we can make Eastern Partnership function and stronger. And the reason why I believe Eastern Partnership is because it's the whole EU initiative, and I don't want to take the responsibility of developing and helping our Eastern partners and helping to solve their problems that much only into this region or on the shoulders of people in this region. On the other hand, I know that all countries here are actively supporting reform in Ukraine and other Eastern Partnership countries. We are the strong proponent of not excluding these countries from the discussion on the EU enlargement, and we will continue to provide our support to Ukraine and Georgia in various formats and bilateral meetings with all the world leaders. So we strongly stand up for our Eastern partners, but definitely I prefer formal frameworks for that.
Mr. Perry.
Let me just add to this that in the audience here is the United States Ambassador to the European Union, Gordon Sondland. And Ambassador Sondland had President Zelensky in Brussels yesterday. Matter of fact, I think it was his first trip out of the country since he was inaugurated. So the idea that he would be here might be a little premature from the standpoint of his travel schedule. But here's what I will tell you, that not only is the United States, but the men and women on this stage are engaged with Ukraine in various and sundry ways to help that country to be stabilized economically and otherwise, because I'm not sure there is a more important message to send, not just in this region and through Europe, but around the world, that as a member of this region and the invasion that occurred there, and for us not to support Ukraine in every reasonable, feasible way that we can, is a irresponsible act. And that the United States, the members of the three Cs, are going to be participating in a host of different ways to make sure that European countries, whether they belong to three Cs or otherwise, know that we are going to stand together and not allow for anyone to coerce another country, particularly using energy as a weapon. It will not stand.
So yeah, kind of terrible. It was terrible enough that no high-ranking Ukrainian official was present, but the reasons for which this was the case make the overall situation much worse. Of course, Rick Perry and others with diplomatic obligations have tried, as it is their duty, to provide alternative explanations, but for those who can read between the lines in diplomatic statements, and for those who took advantage of the accreditation badge to find out the reality, the situation does not look good. It gets even worse when one notices that on the list of high-profile guests, only one representative from Ukraine is listed, and I couldn't find that person in the building, and not for the lack of trying. That's significant, if not even the business community was invited. Hopefully this will be fixed next year, as the president of Estonia has promised, but I gotta say, it ain't looking good, Chief. Really, really bad optics. Now, speaking of bad optics, the third negative development was the presence of Jean-Claude Juncker at the press conference. From a politics perspective and for the future of the initiative, this makes no difference whatsoever. Juncker is on his way out, he won't be part of the next commission, and generally nobody, not even his die-hard fans, really care what he thinks at this point in time, with just weeks until the new commission will be inaugurated. But from an optics perspective, this is a net negative development. The presence of Juncker at the final statement sending the wrong message, essentially. And not just in diplomatic and geopolitical terms, but economic as well. I mean, the reason the business community was attracted to the initiative is precisely because it lived up to the promise of no bureaucracy and lighter red tape. But then having Juncker over there sends the opposite message, namely that we endorse EU style of bureaucracy and regulation. And that is kind of terrible. Now, it could very well be that one of the reasons this was preferred is for organizational reasons, namely that Rick Perry had to leave early. This was the reason touted amongst the attendees. But it would have been better if nobody had replaced Mr. Perry, quite honestly. So yeah, overall negative development, but, let's face it, of a low-tier relevance. Now, a few words about the organizing. I have to admit that it was better than expected, though that doesn't say much since that's a pretty low bar. In terms of treatment of the media, things went smoother than initially expected. The representative of the UCOM, which is the Slovenian government's communication office, was quite nice with us, and that needs to be emphasized because it's not uncommon to get a media liaison that is outright obstructive. It wasn't the case this time around, which is great. Organizing the political gathering at Brdo, on the other hand, was quite a bummer because it is a location quite far away from Ljubljana and thus an additional burden for small organizations, especially in a country where transportation is so bloody expensive, by Intermarium standards. In that regard, I need to thank to our Slovenian friends in the wider network for taking care of us. Otherwise, well, things would have been pretty bad. Alright, so, to sum up. The fourth Intermarium Summit overall went slightly better than the historical norm and also provided the benchmark on how business as usual will look like. And I say this because largely no new ideas emerged at this summit as opposed to the previous two in Warsaw and Bucharest, while the old ones got into implementation. This overall situation is also a positive development in itself precisely because it slowly builds up trust that things are indeed possible, which in turn should make the appearance of more opportunities not a question of if, but a question of when. Those who expect things to go faster should keep in mind that this is largely virgin territory. While the fundamental idea is indeed old, the application of it all the way up to this point is entirely new. Also, do keep in mind that those of us of the opinion that this form of geopolitics is beneficial for our region still have to compete against those of the opinion that this form of geopolitics is bad, namely the Eurofanatics, the Russophiles, but I repeat myself, and of course the good old anti-American voices that permeate the other half of our continent, whose intelligentsia is full of ungrateful pricks. Building the Intermarium will not only take time, but also active efforts, brute work, and, yes, competing ideologically with the foes both within and without our midst. And this latter issue has already been present at the Ljubljana Summit and will be present next year as well, since next year's organizer is the office of the Estonian presidency. Kersti Kaljulaid, the president of the small Baltic state, is an ambivalent individual in terms of geopolitics, so it remains to be seen how things will turn out. The point being that we cannot just go to sleep because things are going largely okay. Those interested in geopolitics should continue to work if things are to continue to go largely okay, especially now as the political direction will be discussed in the next several years in the smaller states of the Intermarium, which, with the exception of Hungary, tend to have a deeply left-wing or leftist leadership. I cannot know, and indeed nobody can know at this point, how things will progress further. But one way to address this is to continue to be vigilant as well as engaged whenever possible. Which is why I'm hoping our network will be able to attend the next year's summit as well, in part so we can start to understand a bit more of the political context in the Baltic region, which, let's face it, is quite alien to most of us at this point in time. Anyway, I guess we'll talk about that as the time of the next summit will draw near. Of course, I will heavily rely on y'all to make that happen as well. So, this concludes the reporting from the fourth summit of the Three Seas Initiative, and I shall now cede the floor to you. I will answer to questions if they are related to aspects that I might have omitted from the coverage, either by mistake or by relevancy judgment calls, though on this channel we did publish even the portions that the Slovenian government's own record didn't, so it's unlikely that we omitted anything anyway. And with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your consistent and generous financial support. Please do consider a donation if you derive any value from the work being done here. Special thanks to our Slovenian friends. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell button to avoid YouTube's shadow banning. Visit our website, and I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.